Hi everyone, welcome to this week's lecture. Today we will be talking about arguing about literature, chapter 6, right? And that's writing about literary genres. So this chapter talks about different literary genres, right? Um, so there's different genres, right? Depending on what sort of art, right, um, you're talking about, right? There's different genres in paintings, right? Different genres in music, different genres in film, right? And so on and so forth, right? For the sake of this class, we'll be focusing on the different genres of literature, right? And that includes novels, right, as a genre, short stories as a genre, poetry, right? Drama. That's drama means sort of stage plays, right? Musical, right? Is also a different genre, right? And there's a couple other things too that I can't think of right now. But for the sake of this class, right, we are obviously just focusing um, on short stories, right? That's where we're only reading short stories, and so I only want to focus about short stories and only cover the parts that the part in the chapter, right, that talks about short stories, because that's what's important for us, right? So I guess like what is a short story, right? And in terms of length, right, you can think of often the way I make the distinction, right? So there's three different kind of different genres, right? That that's close enough to short stories, right? So there's the novel, right? And there's the novella, right? And there's the short story, right? So the way we usually make a distinction is that novellas are often 90 pages to just in terms of pages, right? Novellas are often 90 to 120 pages, right? Anything less than that we consider short stories, right? And so short stories can be one page, it can be half a page, um, or it could be, say, 80 pages, right? And you can still consider that as a short story, right? So again, 90 to 120, I think that would be considered a novella, right? And novellas are actually one of my favorite kind of genres because it's long enough where enough is being told, right? But it's also short enough that you sort of finish it right away and you sort of get the whole story right away, right, in one sitting, for example, right. Some of my favorite novellas, right, are The Death of Ivan Ilyich, for example, by Leo Tolstoy. Um, what else? Death in Venice by Thomas Mann. Um, and a couple of others that I can't think of right now. But those two are my are my favorites, right? So I like the novella, right? And then novels, right? Anything more than 120 pages, right, can be considered a novel. So there are novels that are 150 pages. There are novels that are 2,000 to 3,000 pages, right? One of the most popular novels that are very, very long is a novel by Marcel Proust called La Recherche de Temps Perdu, or In Search of Lost Times, right? And that novel is like, I don't know. I think it's 3 volumes, and I think depending on the translation, because it's originally written in French, depending on translation, it could go up to 4,000 pages, right? So it's a very long book. I've only read the first volume, maybe like 400 pages of it, right? Um, So I'm still yet to finish it. Um, but yeah, so that's the novel, right? So those are the three different kind of like variations, and it's easy, right, to kind of um, mistake a novella for a short story and vice versa, and a novella for a novel and vice versa, right? Um, but yeah, anyway, for this class we're only focusing on short stories, right? Um, and so short stories, there's a quote here on page 138, right, um, of arguing about literature. It says that short fiction is the art of the glimpse, right? It deals in echoes and reverberations. Craftily, it withholds information, right? And while novels tell all, right? So the short story, it's short, and so you can't really say too much, right? And so it gives you sort of like glimpses, right, of a character, glimpses of events, right, where you are given enough to sort of make judgments about it, make interpretations about what it might mean, right? But we don't get enough, right, as much as we can from a novel to actually have sort of substantial interpretations, right? We only get glimpses, right? Um, and so, precisely because the short story is just, we're only giving glimpses, right? And so it's been said that short stories have to be written almost perfectly, right? Because it's very short, and so everything, right, that is given to us in a short story has to mean something, right? Every word has to carry something. Every sentence, right, has to mean something. Every character, every description, um, everything, right, that's been sort of given to us has to be important enough, right, to make us, or it has to be important enough for us to interpret it, right, in the larger sort of meaning, or in sort of the larger, uh, yeah, I guess like the larger meaning of the story, right? Um, and so yeah, so it's been said that it has to be perfect, right? And a lot of times, short stories are the seed, right, of of longer novels, right? A lot of times, writers, novelists start with a short story, right, and then they develop that short story um, into longer novels, right, where we get way more information, way more context, right, about what's going on. But but it's also been said that short stories should be able to stand on its own, right, and should be able to be enough, should be able to say everything that it needs to say, right? That Because it is in itself an entire genre, right? It should not be just a seed for something else, right? It should be short stories should be sort of considered as complete, right? Um, so I think all of these things are, you know, they're all true, right? Short stories can stand on its own. It could also be just a seed for a longer novel, right? Um, so those theories could all be um, true, right? And so since short stories are supposed to be sort of perfect, right? And everything in it is supposed to mean something, right? It is then our job, right, when we're writing about these short stories, when you guys are making arguments about these stories, it's then your job to tell us what those things mean, right? And it's your job to identify, right, what the plot is doing, right? different narrative points of view, right, or are doing, right, what the characters are doing, what the imagery is doing, right. And so we will then kind of now, as indicated here in arguing about literature, we will kind of go through one by one, right? How to think about plot, how to think about point of view, characters, etc., right? When reading a story, right? And this is important because you still have two papers to write after you've already submitted your first paper, and you still have two papers to write, right? And so moving forward, right, as you read the next stories, you'll want to pay attention um, to you know to the plot, to the point of view, to the characters, right, more closely, because this will be the sort of the seed to your argument later on, right? Um, so so let's talk about plot, right? So plot is just some of you, most of you probably know, is just the sort of it's just what's going on in the story, right? What is the story about, right? So in terms of plot, um, for Bullet in the Brain, right? Anders goes Anders, an art critic, right? A kind of snobbish art critic goes into a bank. I don't know. I don't remember that it was indicated why he was in a bank. Maybe he was just there to deposit money or withdraw money, whatever. Right. So he went to a bank, and it just so happened that there was a bank robbery while he was in the bank. Right. And because of his attitude, because of his sort of disconnect from real life experience, maybe, or everyday people, he sort of offended the robbers and he got shot, right? And just before he dies, right, just before the bullet hits the brain, right, he sort of remembers, right, his life sort of flashed in front of his face, so to speak, right, and remembers a different sort of, or remembers a moment in his life when he was young, right, of an event when he was young, right, and also told in the story, right, are the things that he did not remember, right, which also gives us uh, sort of additional context um, to Anders's life, right? So that's the simple plot of the story, right? Um, for everything that rises must converge. The plot is Mother and Julian. Um, they have to. Julian has to take his mother to the YMCA um, for a weight loss program, I think. They have to take a bus, and the mother's a racist and doesn't want to sit in the bus with black people. Right? She gets hit. She gets hit in the face by a black woman, and she experiences memory loss for a little bit, and then it seems she dies right after that. So that's the simple plot, right, of everything that rises. So that's kind of the surface, right? And you want to think about in terms of plot, right? Especially for Bullet in the Brain, everything that rises, right? The you want you understand the surface plot, right? But you want to think deeply, right, about what the plot is doing, right? Because in Bullet in the Brain, for example, right, the plot, the time, right, the narrative is sort of forward moving, right? The first part, and then the second part is sort of backwards moving, where we get information about Anders's past, right? So you'll want to think there, right? What is the plot doing? The plot is giving us two different sort of uh, different times, right? A forward moving time and a backward moving time. So there's a way in which the plot sort of moves forward and then backwards, right? And so you want to think like why is Tobias Wolff doing that, right? Instead of just doing a plot that, you know, that happens sort of chronologically, right? Why does he give us a plot that moves forward and then moves back in time, right? So these are the kinds of things that you want to ask, right? In terms of plot, right? There are also plots that are not always forward moving, right? Sometimes it's a plot that sort of just goes backwards, right? Just recollections and flashbacks and things like that, right? So these all of these things, right, are done intentionally, right? And so you'll want to ask yourself, when you're reading something, why why is the plot this way, right? Why did the author choose to give us this kinds of informations, and what are they not telling us, right? Because sometimes what's not there could be just as important as what's there, right? And so yeah, um, so things like that, right? And traditionally, um, there's what's called in novels, right? We're usually used to thinking about um, the novel as having characters, right? As a progressive sort of narrative plot, right? Where um, something happens to the characters make uh, the character sort of so the protagonist, right, experiences things, is educated, um, and then learns from his or her experiences, right, and then gains wisdom out of that and develops, right. So this idea of the character development, right, where the character sort of um, learns from his or her experience, right, and therefore gains knowledge and wisdom, right. So that's the sort of typical kind of narrative, right, of the novel, right, of stories, right, and that's what's called a Bildungsroman, right. It's a German term, which means Bildung is sort of education, right, and Roman means the novel, right. So education in the novel. So the novel is supposed to be one that educates us as much as it educates the character, and the character develops, right, and becomes a better person for it, right. So that's the kind of uh, that's sort of the trajectory of the traditional novel, right, the Bildungsroman novel. And you can think of Charles Dickens, right, who wrote Oliver Twist, Great Expectations, David Copperfield, right. A lot of um, Charles Dickens's novels, right, are stories of development, right. Usually, a young boy who sort of sometimes, most of the time, young boy is an orphan, right, very, who has very sort of difficult childhood, right, and then he is educated and he sort of he finds a patron that sort of supports his education, right? And then he sort of learns the ways of high society, right? And then becomes a gentleman, right? That's a very simplistic way to sort of narrate that, but that's usually sort of the trajectory, right, of the Bildungsroman, where um, one where the character develops, right, into an older, more learned, more wise um, character, right. But right, so that's the traditional trajectory development, right. But if you think about the novels or the stories that we're reading, right? They're not really development. They're not really stories of development, right? If you think about the mother, she doesn't really develop. If anything, she underdevelops or undevelops, right? So she's the older she gets, the sort of the the more childish she becomes, right? The same with Julian, right? He starts off seeming to be a wiser, more educated man, and then he also acts childish, right? And he also sort of becomes a little boy again towards the end, right? Who cries because he realizes how much he's hurt his mother. So, so that's almost sort of like a flip, right? In this idea of development, right? Um, you could argue, I think, that it is not a story of development, right? But it's a story of how sort of one doesn't actually, just because someone is educated, right? One doesn't necessarily become developed, right? Or does not necessarily become wiser for it, right? So you could argue that, right? Yeah, so that's a long example, but I think you get the point, right? Of how plot, right? It's not plot is not just and not it's not just simple kind of this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, right? Especially for the stories that we're reading, right? Plots are being twisted, plots are being sort of woven in different ways, right? So you'll want to think about the different kind of ways that the plot is sort of complicated, right, in the stories that we will be reading. All right, now let's move on to point of view, right? So this is the point of view of the narrator usually, right? You can I think you can easily sort of um, tell when a story is from the first person, right? Because they will use I, right? The I perspective, right? I did this and did that, yeah. So that means that the narrative point of view is the first person singular, right? I, right? So that kind of perspective, right, gives the story a sort of autobiographical tone, right? It gives it a sense that this is we're following the life of a person from the perspective of that person, right? So there's something personal about it, right? And oftentimes, first-person narratives are effective because we can really sort of relate, right, to the characters because it's the characters that's talking to us, right? Not some, you know, um, some unidentifiable narrator, right? For Bullet in the Brain and Everything That Rises, right? The narrator is omniscient, right? And we'll talk about omniscient narrator later. Um, but the first person, so there's a first person singular that uses I, right? There's also the first person plural, right? That uses we, right? That's not we. Narrator is not very common, right? There's only one that I know of, a novel that has a we narrator in it, and that's On Such a Full Sea by Chung Rae Lee. That's the novel by Chung Rae Lee. It's a great novel. If you are interested in, well, I guess you can check it out for yourself if you want. Um, but the novel uses the perspective of we, right? Because it sort of reinforces the idea, right, that the narrative is about a community, right, a group of people, and not just about one sort of one person, right? And I think it works for that novel specifically, right? Um, All right, so the other point of view that is probably the most common, right, is the omniscient narrator, right? So omniscient is a Latin word which means like omni means sort of all, right? Everything, um, all encompassing, right? And um, scient comes from the Latin word scientia, right, which means knowledge, right? And so omniscient just literally means all knowing, right? So kind of godlike, right? So a narrator that knows everything, right? Um, knows the mind of the characters, knows everything there is to know about, what's going on, right? And sort of is from above, right? That kind of sees everything down there and kind of tells us the story of everyone that's involved, right? Um, Yeah, so that's the sort of omniscient narrator. And so far, we've only had an omniscient narrator. Everything That Rises has an omniscient narrator. Bullet in the Brain has an omniscient narrator, right? And and even if they're omniscient narrator, right, you'll still want to pay attention to the tone of these narrators, right? What kind of information does the narrator sort of tell us, right? Is it an omniscient narrator that acts like God, right? Does the narrator sound like God, or does the narrator sound sort of human, right? And by that I mean, there's a way in which a narrator can sound human because it sort of mocks, it sort of makes fun of the characters, right? Um, and by sounding like God, I mean, do they sound sort of proper? Do they sound sort of objective, right? Like not very emotional, not very judgmental, right? Just kind of there, like, telling us the story, right? And it seems to me, right, that even though the narrators for Bullet in the Brain and Everything That Rises are omniscient, right, they are still sort of, they're not godlike. They're human, or I don't know, human, um, but they are sort of, they're kind of witty. They're funny. They're sarcastic. They're ironic, right? And so it's a different kind of omniscient narrator than we're used to, sort of traditionally, right? Um, so yeah, so pay attention to that moving forward, right? Um, all right, so let's talk about characters, right? Um, so especially with short stories, we only get glimpses, right? And you know, we only get glimpses of the story of the characters, glimpses of their persona or their sort of uh, their biography, right? We don't get a lot, right? Sorry, I'm just reading real quick my notes. Right. So, sorry. Um, right. So for characters, right? Since we are only given glimpses of their personalities, right? What is often being given to us, right, is very important because these information, right, whether it's kind of like a factual sort of information or a personality, right? They usually sort of stick with us, right? Anders, for example, right? We don't know a lot about Anders, but especially in the first part of the story, we don't know a lot about him. But like we're given like little hints about the character, right? That make us say, oh yeah, that's why he's snobbish because A, B, and C, right? That's why he's like this because of this, right? So we get like little glimpses of him, right? And then second half of the story, we get his background, right? And we learn more about him, and then we become more sympathetic towards him. I think I did, right? Um, and so yeah, so you'll want to pay attention to how the characters are being described, right? What kind of information we learn about them, right? And then how they develop, right? If they do develop, or how they do not develop, right? So you'll want to pay attention to that. Right. So also in terms of characters, right, you'll want to think about this idea of the protagonist, the antagonist, right? Um, and so I think the difference between protagonist, right, is usually the sort of the hero, right? And then the antagonist is the villain, right? But I think there's a crucial difference between protagonist, antagonist, and hero and villain, right? And that's that protagonists and antagonists are, I think, hero and villain are more clear cut, right? The hero is more of a, where it's clearer, right, that a hero is a good person, ethical person, moral person, here to save the day, blah blah blah, right? And usually a villain is just an evil person, irredeemably evil, you know, he or she is gonna end up dead at the end of the story, right? So that's usually how we think about hero and villain, right? But for protagonist and antagonist, I think it's more complicated, right? Because I would I would use protagonist and antagonist when the characters are more complicated, right? The hero, for example, if we can call, right, in Everything That Rises, if we can call Julian a hero, right, I think we could probably call him a protagonist, right, and then maybe the mother an antagonist, right. Um, but at the end of the story, it's not clear who's the hero and who's the villain, right? Because in the beginning, it seems like Julian is the hero, and then the mother is the villain, right? But then at the end, you're not really sure, right? Because we've learned all of these things, and that they're actually both messed up, right? Um, and so I think that's the difference, the distinction between protagonist and antagonist, is that the antagonist and protagonist, they're more complicated, right? And um, they're more sort of willing to change, right? And more willing to develop, right? Um, so I think those are the two differences, or those are the differences between protagonist, antagonist, villain, hero, right? Um, all right, and lastly, let me read a passage from page 149. Um, Quote, what power and influence people achieve may depend on particular traits of theirs. These include their gender, social class, race, ethnic background, nationality, sexual orientation, age, and the kind of work they do. Because these attributes may greatly affect a person's life, pay attention to them as you analyze characters. Right. So, in terms of thinking about characters, right, you also want to think about, you know, issues of gender, issues of social class, issues of race, sexual orientation, age, whatever, right? So all of these things, right? These seemingly kind of um, I was going to say outside things, but I mean gender is not necessarily an outside thing, although it is. It is an outside thing in the sense that one is discriminated against, for example, as being a woman, right? Being discriminated against as being gay or lesbian or whatever, right? And so yeah, so you want to think about issues of race, issues of class, issues of gender, issues of age, right? And how that plays a part in the development of the character or the lack of development of the character, right? So that's also one way, right, to think about characters. Right? All right, so quickly, imagery, right? So imagery literally comes from image, right? So images in the story, right, that might be give us a clue um, to sort of certain meanings and certain patterns about the story, right? So um, yeah, I think we've kind of talked about imagery, throughout the lecture, right? But again, pay attention to, for example, how Flannery O'Connor sort of describes her character's face, right? The image that she describes the face, the way she describes body parts, the way she describes nature, the way she describes the neighborhood, right, in a certain way, right? So these images, right, that are being um, they're almost kind of like picturesque images in the story, right? That's being described, right? Pay attention to those, right? Because those usually are indicative of something in terms of interpreting the meaning of the story, right? Um, so yeah, so different images um, and descriptions, right, of these images, right? I guess quick story. In terms of images, right? And and if you read enough sort of novels, like I have, a lot of short stories and novellas, like I have, you'll remember sort of different scenes, different descriptions. Like I specifically remember, I think like I remember characters. You know, I remember usually the plot, right? When I read, but I usually remember images, descriptions of images in the stories that I read, right? And I think that's why they're important, because if you sort of can imagine, like, so the way that something is described, right, on paper, on the story, right, you can kind of imagine it, and you can kind of print an image in your head of what that looks like, right? That image, right, kind of stays with you. It stays with me, right? Um, and and one of, I think, the easiest one for me to remember is a scene from um, Willa Cather's novel My Antonia, right? And in the scene, right, there's a group of friends, and they were about to, it was the summer in Nebraska, and they were about to separate. One has to go to the city to finish um, schooling, while the others have to stay in town, right, and continue to work, right. And they had spent the summer together. They were good friends, and now they have to part ways, right. And so they went to the field, right, this open field in Nebraska. Um, Nebraska has a lot of open fields, a lot of sort of um, empty lands, right? And so you have a clear view of the sun, of the sky, of the sun, right? So they were these group of friends were just sitting there on the field, looking over to or kind of watching the sunset, right? And as the sun was sort of setting, right, the ball of the sun was sort of reaching the horizon, right? And as it reaches the horizon, they see this sort of um, vertical thing, right, that's sort of imprinted in front of the disk of the sun, right? And and it was just an image of this of the bright sky, the disk of the sun, right? And then there's this one like black line that sort of drawn across the disk of the sun, right? And it was just a perfect, it was a beautiful description, right, of how the sun was setting, and then there was this sort of thing in front of it, right? And then as the sun sort of came down, they found out that it was a plow, right? So there was a plow that was kind of sticking on the land, right? And then the disk of the sun just kind of like went down behind it, and so you could see the plow in front of the disk of the sun, right? And it was just a very beautiful description. I don't know why. I don't know what it means, right? But it was just a beautiful description of an image, right, of these friends sort of watching the sunset and seeing that plow in front of the sun, right, as it sets. Um, so yeah, so things like that, right? I think that's why sort of these images are important because they sort of they stay with us, right? And they also mean something, right? All right, let's move on. um, Language now, right? So in terms of language, you'll want to focus on the story's title, right? The style, and the dialogues, right? So in terms of title, we've talked about title already, and how titles just, it means a lot, right? If you just try to make sense of the title before reading the story, right, you can already, I think you will have some idea of what the story might sort of be about, right? Or after reading the story and then you go back to the title, and the title will make so much more sense, right? And so in terms of style, right, you'll want to focus on the tone of the narrator and the characters, right? So um, yeah, so this also kind of intersects with uh, the characters, right, or the narrator, right? What kind of tone does the narrator sort of use, right? So the tone of the narrator is also the style, right? And in Bullet in the Brain and in Everything That Rises, there's a sense that the tone of the narrator is almost, like I said, mocking, right? Sarcastic, ironic, right? In Everything That Rises, you can probably even say that it's almost kind of like gossip-like, right? It's almost as if the narrator is sort of gossiping to us about what's going on between this mother and son, right? Because there's some kind of like sarcasm, right, in the tone of the narrator, right? So that right is considered right the style of the language, right? The tone of the story, right? Um, and then in terms of dialogue, right? Like I said, the short stories are short, and so whatever dialogues are being used, right? They're being used for a reason, right? And so you want to know, like, why did they choose to? Well, why did the author choose this specific conversation, right? Why are these kinds of informations that are being told to us, right? What's important about that, right? In the case of Julian and the mother, right, it's usually um, in the sort of dialogues that we get information about the background of the mother and and her sort of um, her upbringing, right? The plantations, owning slaves, and this and that, right? We usually get those information from the dialogues, right? So what's going on in the dialogue, right? The language of the dialogue is very important to understanding sort of certain kinds of meanings, right, or interpretations um, about the story, right? Um, so yeah, so I think those are sort of the main elements, right, that you'll want to pay attention to when you read the next um, when you read the next um, short stories, right? And so, yeah, you can't. Sorry, I got distracted because I'm recording this while also kind of like paying attention to election, and then there was a news feed that Trump won Florida and Ohio, but it's not over yet. So um, anyway, yeah. So where was I? So yeah, so you can't as you read the short stories, right? You can't always pay attention to everything, right? But try to choose one, right? Pay attention to the character, just the character throughout, right? Or just the language, right? And then that will usually be a good seed for your for what you will want to argue about in your future papers. Right? So so yeah, so I think that's it for now. And email me if you have any questions about this.